On Monday, I got a bank notification. Balance, minus $300,000. Then a message came in. Thanks for the house and the car, mother-in-law. I just smiled. My dear daughter-in-law had no idea whose card that was. The next day, the surprise came. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. I was folding laundry in my bedroom when my phone buzzed with a bank notification. At 64, I'd gotten used to checking every alert carefully. 3 years of widowhood had taught me to pay attention to details that Harold used to handle. The number on the screen made my hands freeze mid-fold. Balance, minus $312,000. I stared at the notification, certain there had to be some mistake. Banks made errors all the time, didn't they? But as I opened the app with trembling fingers, the transactions were all there in black and white. A house purchase for $250,000, a car for $42,000, various smaller purchases that added up to $20,000 more. Then my phone chimed with a text message. The number wasn't in my contacts, but the words made my blood run cold. Thanks for the house and the car, mother-in-law. Melissa. My daughter-in-law of 7 years had somehow gotten access to my account and spent my entire inheritance from Harold. The money I'd been saving to leave to my son David, the nest egg that was supposed to keep me secure in my old age. I sat heavily on my bed, the folded shirt scattered around me. My chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing my heart with both hands. How had this happened? I was always so careful with my cards, my passwords, my personal information. But even as the shock washed over me, something else stirred in my chest. Not just hurt or fear, but a cold, calculating anger. Because deep down, in a place I hadn't wanted to acknowledge, I'd been expecting something like this. For months I'd noticed small things. The way Melissa's eyes would linger on my jewelry when she visited. How she'd casually ask about my finances, disguising her questions as concern for my well-being. The way she'd started volunteering to help with my banking, offering to drive me to appointments, always so helpful, always so caring. And David, my sweet boy who'd become distant since marrying her, who suddenly had opinions about how I spent my money, suggestions about downsizing, comments about how I didn't really need such a big house now that Dad was gone. Called David first. He picked up on the third ring, his voice distracted. Hi, Mom. What's up? I'm kind of busy right now. David, I need you to come over. Something's happened with my bank account. There was a pause. What kind of something? Someone used my card to make some very large purchases. I think someone stole from me. Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Gotten defensive. Mom, are you sure you didn't just forget? You know, sometimes older people get confused about their spending. The casual cruelty of it hit me like a slap. My own son, suggesting I was some senile old woman who couldn't manage her own affairs. David, I'm talking about over $300,000. I don't forget spending that kind of money. 300. He went quiet. I could hear muffled voices in the background, and I realized Melissa was there with him. Look, Mom, I'll come by later, okay? We'll figure this out. He hung up before I could respond. I sat in the silence of my empty house, the house Harold and I had shared for 32 years, and felt more alone than I had even in those first dark months after his funeral. At least then I'd had David. He'd checked on me daily, helped with arrangements, held my hand during the hardest moments. Now I understood why that had changed. 2 hours later, David's car pulled into my driveway. I watched from the living room window as both he and Melissa got out. She was carrying a small gift bag and wearing that bright smile she always put on for me, the one that never quite reached her eyes. They used David's key to come in, something that had started bothering me lately but that I'd never said anything about. Families should feel comfortable in each other's homes, right? Mom, David called out. We're here. I stayed seated in my armchair, the bank statements printed out and waiting on the coffee table in front of me. They came into the living room together, Melissa immediately moving to kiss my cheek. Carol, sweetie, David told me you had some banking confusion. I brought you some of those cookies from that bakery you like. Banking confusion. As if I'd simply misplaced a $20 bill. Sit down, both of you, I said quietly. David perched on the edge of the sofa, his leg bouncing nervously. Melissa settled in beside him, still wearing that practiced smile. I picked up the first bank statement and held it out to them. Can you explain this to me? David barely glanced at it. Mom, look, sometimes with online banking there can be delays in posting or duplicate charges or… David. My voice cut through his rambling. Look at it. He finally took the paper from my hand. I watched his face as his eyes scanned the transactions, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his mouth open and close without sound. Beside him, Melissa had gone very still. Where did you get the down payment for your new house? I asked conversationally. Mom, I can explain. And the car? That new BMW that Melissa's been driving around town. Melissa finally spoke, her voice sweet and concerned. Carol, I think there might be some confusion here. David and I have been saving for years. Have you? I leaned back in my chair, studying them both. Because according to these statements, the money came directly from my account. My card was used. My authorization. That's impossible, David said quickly. You must have. Must have what, son? Must have bought myself a house I've never seen? Must have purchased a car I don't drive. The silence stretched between us. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway ticking, marking the seconds as my son struggled to find words that would make this okay. Finally, Melissa reached over and took his hand. David, maybe we should tell her. Tell me what? I didn't say it out loud, but I didn't have to. David looked up at me, and for a moment I saw the boy I'd raised, the child who used to climb into my bed during thunderstorms. Mom, we needed a fresh start. The apartment was too small, and with Melissa's student loans we couldn't qualify for a mortgage on our own. We thought maybe you could help us out. Just temporarily. By stealing from me? We didn't steal. Melissa's mask slipped for just a second, revealing something sharp underneath. David is your son. Family helps family. Family asks for help. Family doesn't sneak around and take without permission. We were going to tell you, David said miserably. We were going to pay you back. With what money? David, you work part-time at that computer repair shop. Melissa hasn't worked in 2 years. I watched them exchange a glance, and something cold settled in my stomach. There was something else. Something they weren't telling me. How did you get my card information? I asked quietly. Another glance between them. David's leg was bouncing faster now. David, how did you get access to my account? When he finally answered, his voice was barely above a whisper. I copied your card when I was helping you with groceries last month. And I saw you enter your PIN at the store. The betrayal cut deeper than the theft. This wasn't some stranger who'd skimmed my card at a restaurant. This was my son, the child I'd carried for 9 months, raised for 18 years, loved unconditionally for 31 years, who had watched me type in my PIN and memorized it so he could rob me. But what hurt most was the realization that this wasn't impulse. This was planned, calculated. They'd been watching me, studying my habits, waiting for their chance. And suddenly I smiled. My smile seemed to unnerve them more than my anger had. David shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Melissa's perfectly manicured fingers tightened around the gift bag she was still holding. What's funny, Mom? David asked, his voice uncertain. Nothing's funny, sweetheart. I'm just thinking. I stood up slowly, my joints protesting after sitting for so long. I'm going to make some tea. We have a lot to discuss. In the kitchen, I filled the kettle with hands that were steadier than they'd been in hours. Through the pass-through window, I could see David and Melissa huddled together on the sofa, whispering urgently. Melissa kept glancing toward the kitchen, her face tight with something that looked like fear. Good. She should be afraid. While the water heated, I opened my laptop on the kitchen counter. Harold had always teased me about being old-fashioned, but I'd learned to navigate the internet well enough in the years since his death. Loneliness had driven me to social media, and boredom had taught me how to research. I typed Melissa Richardson into the search bar, then paused. Richardson had been her maiden name. Before David, she'd been married to someone else. A brief marriage, she'd told us. A mistake she'd made in her early 20s. But what had been her husband's name? I tried Melissa Richardson marriage records and started scrolling. It took me 20 minutes in 3 different search engines, but I found it. Melissa Richardson Walsh, married to Thomas Walsh in 2015. Divorced in 2017. Thomas Walsh. The name sounded familiar, but I couldn't place it. I searched for him next and my blood ran cold. Local man loses life savings to marriage scam. Read the headline from a Phoenix newspaper dated 3 years ago. The article described how Thomas Walsh, a 68-year-old retiree, had met a young woman online who'd convinced him to marry her after a whirlwind 6-month romance. Within 2 years, she'd emptied his accounts and disappeared, leaving him penniless and facing foreclosure. The woman's name in the article was Michelle Richards, but the photograph showed Melissa's face. Younger, different hair color, but unmistakably her. I kept searching, my heart pounding as the pieces fell into place. Michelle Richards, Melissa Richardson, different names, same person. And Thomas Walsh wasn't the only victim. There was a Robert Chen in Portland who'd lost his retirement savings to a woman matching Melissa's description. A William Martinez in Denver who'd been left bankrupt after a brief marriage to someone who called herself Mary Richmond. My daughter-in-law was a con artist, a professional predator who targeted older men with money. But David wasn't old. David was 31, barely older than she was. The kettle whistled, making me jump. I turned off the stove with shaking hands, trying to process what I'd discovered. Why would Melissa target my son when he didn't have any money of his own? Unless I was the real target. Unless David had been the way to get to me. I thought about their courtship. How quickly it had moved. How Melissa had been so interested in family dinners, so eager to help around the house. How she'd asked so many questions about Harold's life insurance, about our investments, about what David could expect to inherit someday. She'd been playing the long game. I printed out the articles and tucked them into a folder, then prepared the tea tray. When I returned to the living room, David and Melissa were sitting farther apart, their whispered conversation having ended the moment they heard my footsteps. "Here we are," I said pleasantly, setting the tray on the coffee table. "Melissa dear, would you prefer sugar or honey?" She looked surprised by my calm tone. "Sugar, please." I handed her a cup and saucer, then served David his tea the way he'd preferred it since he was a teenager. Strong with just a splash of milk. "Now then," I said, settling back into my armchair. "I think we need to have an honest conversation about what's really going on here." David opened his mouth, probably to launch into another explanation, but I held up my hand to stop him. "Let me start," I said. "Melissa, how long have you been planning this?" Her cup rattled slightly against the saucer. "Planning what?" "The theft. The marriage to David. All of it." David looked confused. "Mom, what are you talking about? Melissa didn't plan anything. We fell in love and—" "Did you, sweetheart? Did you really fall in love?" I looked at my son, this man I'd raised to be honest and kind, and felt my heart break all over again. "Or did Melissa seek you out specifically because you were my son?" "That's ridiculous," Melissa said, but her voice had lost its sweet tone. "Carol, I understand you're upset about the money, but these accusations are—" "Tell me about Thomas Walsh." The color drained from her face so quickly I thought she might faint. David looked back and forth between us, clearly lost. "Who's Thomas Walsh?" he asked. "Your wife's first husband. The one she robbed blind before she moved on to her next victim." I reached for the folder I'd left on the side table. "Would you like to see the newspaper articles? Or should I tell you about Robert Chen? William Martinez? How many others have there been, Melissa?" She stood up abruptly, her teacup crashing to the floor. The delicate china Harold's mother had given us shattered into pieces, and somehow that felt symbolic. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice was shaking now. "Don't I?" I looked up at her calmly. "Michelle Richards. Mary Richmond. How many names have you used over the years?" David was staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. "Melissa, what is she talking about?" Melissa spun to face him, her mask slipping completely now. Gone was the sweet, helpless young woman who'd needed his protection. In her place stood someone harder, colder, desperate. "David, she's lying. She's a bitter old woman who can't stand that her son loves someone more than he loves her." But David wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at me, and I saw the moment understanding began to dawn in his eyes. "Mom, how did you know about her first marriage? We never told you his name." I handed him the folder. "Because I looked it up. Something about this whole situation didn't feel right, so I started researching." He opened the folder with trembling hands. I watched his face as he read, watched the color drain away, watched his world crumble with each new revelation. "These can't be real," he whispered. "Google them yourself," I said gently. "The newspaper archives are all online." Melissa was backing toward the door, her purse clutched in her hands. "David, you're not going to believe this garbage, are you? I love you. We have a life together." David looked up from the papers, and there were tears in his eyes. "Is it true?" "Of course it's not true." "Then why are you running?" She stopped caught. For a moment, she just stood there in my living room doorway, and I could see her calculating her options. Finally she laughed. It was a cold, bitter sound, nothing like the musical giggle she'd always used around David. "You want the truth? Fine. Yes, I married you to get to her money. Yes, I've done this before. But so what? You think any of those old men didn't get something out of the deal? They got to feel young again. They got to feel like someone beautiful actually wanted them." David made a sound like he'd been punched. "And you," she continued, pointing at me, "you've been suspicious from the beginning. Always watching, always judging. Well, congratulations, Carol. You figured it out. But you know what? It doesn't matter. Doesn't it?" Her smile was sharp as glass. "Because David chose me. He chose me over you when he helped me get access to your money. He's not your little boy anymore. He's my husband, and he's going to stay my husband." She looked at David, who was still staring at the papers in his lap. "Because where else is he going to go? Back to mommy? After what he did? After he betrayed his own mother for me?" The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Even now, even caught in her lies, she was trying to manipulate him, trying to convince him that he was as guilty as she was, that they were bound together by shared crime. But I wasn't worried anymore. Because Melissa had made one crucial mistake in all her planning, all her research, all her careful manipulation. She'd underestimated me. And tomorrow she was going to find out just how big a mistake that had been. After they left that night, David stumbling out behind his wife like a man in a trance, I sat in my living room surrounded by the shards of broken china, and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Absolute clarity. I swept up the pieces of Harold's mother's teacup, each fragment a small reminder that some things, once broken, could never be put back together the same way. But sometimes I thought as I dumped the pieces into the trash, breaking was the first step toward building something stronger. The next morning I drove to the bank. Not my usual branch where everyone knew me as Harold's widow, the sweet old lady who came in monthly to check her statements. Instead, I went downtown to the main office and asked to speak with someone about fraud protection. The young man who helped me, Marcus, had kind eyes and the patience to explain things without talking down to me. When I told him about the unauthorized charges, he immediately began the process of flagging the transactions. "Mrs. Peterson, I have to ask," he said gently, "do you know who had access to your card information?" "My son and his wife," I said simply. His expression grew carefully neutral. Family fraud was always complicated, I could see him thinking. Messy. Often, older victims refused to press charges. "What would you like to do about this?" he asked. I leaned forward, meeting his eyes directly. "I want to set up monitoring on all my accounts. And I want to open a new account that only I have access to." "Of course. And the fraudulent charges? Leave them for now. I'm handling this privately." He nodded, though I could see the confusion in his face. Most people would want their money back immediately. But Marcus didn't know what I knew. Those charges had been made with a very special card. 3 months earlier, when I'd first started noticing Melissa's unusual interest in my finances, I'd done something that Harold would have called paranoid. I'd gone to a different bank and opened what they called a controlled spending account. It was linked to my main account but had built-in limits and tracking features designed for people who wanted to monitor their spending habits. Or, in my case, monitor someone else's. I transferred exactly $400,000 into that account and had a debit card made. Then I'd very carefully left that card where David might find it when he was helping me with groceries, making sure it looked just like my regular card. I'd even practiced entering a fake PIN in front of him several times, making little mistakes and starting over, the way someone my age might genuinely struggle with numbers. The beautiful thing about the controlled account was that it tracked everything. Not just what was purchased, but where, when, and even photographs of the cardholder if the merchant had security cameras. Every transaction sent an alert to my phone with a detailed receipt. I'd watched in real time as they bought their house. I'd gotten photos of Melissa signing the paperwork, of David shaking hands with the real estate agent. I had documentation of every lie they'd told me, every moment they'd spent my money while looking me in the eye and pretending to care about my well-being. But more than that, I'd been tracking their other activities too. After discovering Melissa's history, I'd hired a private investigator. Not some dramatic Hollywood type, but a quiet woman named Janet who specialized in background checks and insurance fraud. She'd been worth every penny. Janet had uncovered things even my internet research had missed. Melissa wasn't just running marriage scams. She was involved in credit card fraud, identity theft, and had at least 3 different social security numbers. She'd been arrested twice but had never been convicted, always managing to disappear before trials could begin. She was also still legally married to Thomas Walsh. Their divorce had never been finalized, which meant her marriage to David wasn't valid, which meant David could walk away from this with minimal legal consequences if he chose to. But that was up to him. I spent the morning organizing my evidence. Photos, bank records, newspaper articles, the private investigator's report. Everything neatly filed in folders with dates and cross-references. Harold had always said I had a mind for details, and he was right. By noon, I had a complete picture of exactly who my daughter-in-law really was and what she'd done. Not just to me but to at least 4 other families that we knew of. The question now was what to do with that information. I could call the police. With the evidence I had, Melissa would almost certainly go to prison. But that would mean David going to prison too, and despite everything he was still my son. I could confront them again, demand they return the money. But they'd already spent it on a house and car they couldn't afford to lose. Or I could wait. Because if I'd learned anything about predators like Melissa, it was that they never stopped hunting. They couldn't. It was who they were. And when she made her next move, I'd be ready. That evening David called. His voice was hollow, defeated. "Mom, we need to talk." "Do we? I know you're angry. I know what we did was wrong. But Melissa, she's not the person those articles make her out to be. People can change." I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar ache in my chest. My beautiful, naive son still believing in fairy tales. Can they, David? Yes. She loves me, Mom. I know she does. And she's pregnant. The lie was so smooth, so practiced that I almost admired its efficiency. Of course she was pregnant. It was the oldest trick in the book, the perfect way to keep him tied to her even as her world began to crumble. "Congratulations," I said quietly. "So you understand why I can't just walk away. Why we need to work this out as a family." Family. The word that had always been my weakness, the lever she'd known exactly how to use. "What do you want from me, David?" "Help us figure out how to pay you back. Maybe we could set up some kind of payment plan or..." "With what income?" Silence. Because of course they had no income. No real jobs, no savings, no assets except the ones they bought with my money. "I know it looks bad," he said finally. "But we'll figure something out. Melissa has some ideas." Of course she did. More victims to target, more elderly people to charm and rob. The pregnancy story would be perfect for that. A young couple struggling to make ends meet, needing just a little help to get back on their feet. "David," I said, my voice gentler than he deserved, "what happens if she leaves you?" "She won't." "But what if she does? What if this baby isn't real? What if everything she's told you is a lie?" "Mom, please don't do this. Don't make me choose between you and my wife." But he already had chosen. He'd chosen her the moment he copied my card, the moment he watched me enter my PIN and memorized it for later use. He'd chosen her over the woman who'd raised him, loved him, sacrificed for him. The only question now was whether he'd figure that out before it was too late. "I love you, David," I said. "But I won't be anyone's victim. Not even yours." I hung up before he could respond. Outside, the autumn wind was picking up, rattling the windows of the house where I'd lived for over 3 decades. The house I'd shared with Harold, where we'd raised our son, where we'd planned to grow old together. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in Harold's old chair, looking at the photo of our family on the mantel. David at 10 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, standing between his parents who thought they had everything figured out. We'd been so careful to teach him right from wrong, to instill values and morals and respect for others. We'd thought we'd raised a good man. Maybe we had. Maybe the David I'd loved was still in there somewhere, buried under layers of manipulation and desperation. Or maybe some people really were beyond saving. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "This isn't over." I smiled and typed back, "You're right. It isn't." Because Melissa had just made her second mistake. She'd threatened me. And now I was going to show her exactly what happened to people who threatened Carol Peterson. 2 weeks passed in blessed silence. No calls from David, no threatening texts from Melissa, no unexpected visits. I almost let myself believe they'd moved on to easier targets. I should have known better. The knock came on a Tuesday morning while I was tending to my garden. Harold had always said I had the best roses in the neighborhood, and even at 64, I wasn't ready to let them go to seed. I was deadheading the last of the autumn blooms when I heard the tentative rap on my front door. Through the peephole I saw Melissa standing on my porch, but she looked nothing like the confident predator who'd stormed out of my living room 2 weeks ago. Her hair was unwashed and pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her designer clothes had been replaced by jeans and a wrinkled sweater. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if expecting someone to follow her. I took my time answering, letting her knock twice more before I finally opened the door with the chain still attached. "Carol," she said, and her voice was different too. Smaller. Scared. "Please, I need to talk to you. We have nothing to discuss. It's about David. Something's wrong with him. I think he might hurt himself." The words hit me like a physical blow. Exactly as she'd intended. Even knowing what she was, even understanding her methods, the mention of my son in danger cut straight through my defenses. I closed the door, unlatched the chain, and opened it again. "Come in." She hurried inside, glancing around my living room as if seeing it for the first time. Her gaze lingered on the family photos, the small valuable items Harold and I had collected over the years. Even in crisis she was cataloging, calculating. "Sit down," I said. "Tell me what's wrong with David." She perched on the edge of the sofa where she and David had sat together that night, when their world had started to crumble. Her hands were shaking as she twisted them in her lap. "He hasn't been the same since you showed him those articles. He barely sleeps, barely eats. Yesterday I found him in the bathroom with a bottle of pills." "What kind of pills?" "Sleeping pills. He said he couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the shame of what we did to you. He keeps saying he's destroyed everything, that you'll never forgive him." Despite everything, despite knowing who she was and what she'd done, I felt my maternal instincts stir. David had always been sensitive, prone to taking things too much to heart. When he was 8, he'd cried for hours after accidentally stepping on a butterfly. "Where is he now?" I asked. "At home. He wouldn't come with me. He said he didn't deserve to face you again." Tears began sliding down her cheeks, and if I hadn't done my research, I might have believed they were real. "Carol, I know you hate me. I know what you found out about my past, and I don't blame you for not trusting me. But David is a good man. He only did what he did because I convinced him it was the right thing." She leaned forward, reaching for my hands. I let her take them, noting how cold her fingers were, how her pulse was racing. "I know I can't make up for what I've done," she continued. "But maybe there's a way to fix this. For David's sake." "What do you mean?" "The house, the car, everything we bought with your money. We could sell it all, give you back what we owe you. I know it would take time, but we could work out a payment plan, or..." "You can't sell a house you just bought. You'd lose money on the transaction costs alone." She nodded eagerly. I know, but there might be another way. I've been thinking about this constantly, trying to figure out how to make things right. Here it comes, I thought. The real reason for this visit. "My grandmother left me some jewelry," she said. "Family heirlooms, very valuable pieces. I could sell them, but I'd need some upfront money to get them properly appraised and authenticated. If you could lend me maybe $50,000 just temporarily, I could turn it into enough to pay you back everything we owe you." There it was. The con within the con, the scam wrapped in contrition and concern. She needed seed money for her next score, probably had victims already lined up, and she was trying to get me to bankroll my own continued victimization. But what made it truly diabolical was how she'd wrapped it in David's supposed mental health crisis. She knew exactly which buttons to push, exactly how to make a mother's love work against her own best interests. "Show me," I said. "What?" "The jewelry. If it's valuable enough to solve all our problems, I'd like to see it." She hesitated, her mouth opening and closing as she searched for an excuse. "It's in a safety deposit box. I'd need the money for the appraisal before I could." "Melissa," I said gently, "do you think I'm stupid?" She blinked, her performance faltering for just a moment. "There is no jewelry," I continued. "There is no payment plan. There probably isn't even a mental health crisis, is there? David's fine, isn't he?" "No, he's really. Where is he right now?" "I told you, he's at home." I picked up my phone and dialed David's cell number. It rang 4 times before he answered, his voice cheerful and normal. "Hey, Mom. What's up? Just wanted to hear your voice, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" "I'm good. Actually, I'm great. Melissa and I just got back from looking at nursery furniture. We found the perfect crib set." In the background, I could hear music playing, the sound of normal conversation. He wasn't home alone, paralyzed by guilt and contemplating suicide. He was out shopping, probably using credit cards they couldn't afford to pay off. "That's wonderful, honey. Is Melissa with you?" A pause. "No, she had some errands to run." "Why?" "No reason. I love you." "Love you too, Mom." I hung up and looked at Melissa, who had gone very pale. "He sounded quite cheerful for someone contemplating suicide," I observed. She started to speak, then stopped. The mask was slipping again, revealing the calculating predator underneath. "Here's what I think happened," I said conversationally. "You've been trying to figure out how to get more money out of me, and you decided to play the concerned daughter-in-law card. You figured if you couldn't manipulate me directly, you could use my love for David to do it." She was backing toward the door again, her purse clutched against her chest. "But you made a mistake," I continued. "You assumed I was like your other victims, isolated, desperate for family connection, willing to believe anything that gave me hope of keeping my son in my life. Carol, please, you don't understand." "Oh, but I do understand. Perfectly." I stood up, moving between her and the door. "I understand that you're running out of options. The house payments are probably already behind, aren't they? The car payments too. You spent my money faster than you expected, and now the bills are coming due." Her breathing was getting shallow, panicked. "I understand that David is starting to see through your lies, which means you need a new source of income fast. And I understand that you thought I'd be an easy mark for one more con." "You're crazy," she whispered. "Am I? Then why don't we call David back and ask him to confirm your story about the pills and the suicide threats?" She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. We both knew what David would say. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. She fumbled for the door handle, her composure completely shattered now. "This isn't over, Carol. You think you're so smart, but you don't know everything. David is my husband. He chose me. And when push comes to shove, he'll choose me again." "Will he?" She paused in the doorway, something desperate flickering in her eyes. "You want to know the truth? Fine. Yes, I married him for your money. Yes, I've done this before. But David knows that now, and he's still with me. Because I'm pregnant with his child, and family means everything to him." "Are you really pregnant, Melissa?" "Yes." "Then you won't mind taking a test to prove it." The silence stretched between us, filled with all the lies she couldn't take back. Finally she smiled, and it was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. "You'll find out soon enough," she said. "When your grandchild is born and you're not allowed to see them because you're a bitter old woman who tried to destroy their parents' marriage." Then she was gone, leaving me standing in my doorway with my heart pounding and my mind racing. Because despite everything I knew about her, despite all the evidence I'd gathered, part of me was terrified she might be right. What if David really would choose her in the end? What if I was about to lose my son forever? But as I closed and locked my door, I realized something else. Melissa had just given me exactly what I needed to end this once and for all. I waited exactly 24 hours before making my move. Long enough for Melissa to report back to David about her failed attempt at my house, long enough for them to start panicking about their next step, but not long enough for them to disappear entirely. The call came at 8:30 on Wednesday evening. David's number, but I could hear the strain in his voice before he even spoke. Mom, we need to meet. All three of us. Tonight. Where? Neutral ground. That coffee shop on 5th Street, the one near the bookstore. 9 o'clock. I almost smiled. Even now, he was trying to protect his wife by choosing a public place where I couldn't make a scene. My sweet, naive son still didn't understand who he was really protecting her from. I'll be there, I said. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a corner table with a clear view of the entrance. The evening crowd was thin. A few college students with laptops, an elderly man reading a newspaper, a young mother trying to convince her toddler to eat a muffin instead of throwing it on the floor. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that they were about to witness the end of a very carefully constructed lie. David and Melissa arrived exactly on time. He looked haggard, older than his 31 years, while she had made an effort to clean herself up since yesterday. Fresh makeup, clean clothes, that practiced smile back in place. But I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted around the room before settling on me. They sat across from me at the small round table. David immediately reached for my hands. Mom, I'm so sorry about yesterday. Melissa told me what happened, and I want you to know that we never meant. David, I said quietly, stop. He blinked, surprised by the calm in my voice. I know about the pregnancy lie, I continued. Melissa stiffened. It's not a lie. I'm carrying your son's child. Are you? Because I spoke with Dr. Martinez this afternoon. The color drained from both their faces. Dr. Martinez had been my gynecologist for 20 years before I'd stopped needing those services. More importantly, he'd become Melissa's doctor 6 months ago. You can't legally. David started. I can't get specific medical information, no. But I can ask about appointment schedules for family planning purposes. I looked directly at Melissa. Imagine my surprise when Dr. Martinez told me you haven't been in for a pregnancy test or prenatal appointment. In fact, your last visit was for birth control pills. Melissa's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. He was very concerned when I mentioned you thought you might be pregnant. Said you should come in immediately for proper testing and care. Funny thing though, when his office called to schedule an appointment, your number had been disconnected. David turned to stare at his wife. Melissa. I was waiting to be sure. Sometimes tests can be wrong. For 2 months. I asked. You've been claiming to be pregnant for 2 months, but you haven't seen a doctor? I saw a different doctor. One who takes our insurance. Which doctor? Silence. What's his name? Where's his office? Surely you have appointment cards, prescription bottles, something to show David that you're really carrying his child. David was looking at her with growing horror. Melissa, just show her the pregnancy test. The one from the bathroom that day. You kept it, right? I threw it away. No, you didn't. I saw you put it in your jewelry box. You said you wanted to keep it as a memento of when we found out about the baby. More silence. Get it, he said, his voice harder than I'd heard it in years. Go home and get it right now. Bring it back here and show my mother the pregnancy test. David, you're being ridiculous. We don't have to prove anything to her. Yes, we do. He stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor, drawing glances from other customers. Because if you're lying about this, if you're lying about carrying my child, then what else have you been lying about? I could see the exact moment Melissa realized she'd lost him. Her face went through a series of expressions: panic, calculation, desperation, before settling on something cold and furious. Fine, she said. You want the truth? I'm not pregnant. I never was. But so what? We're married, David. I'm your wife. No, I said quietly, you're not. They both turned to stare at me. I opened my purse and pulled out a manila folder. Your divorce from Thomas Walsh was never finalized, Melissa. You're still legally married to him, which means your marriage to David is invalid. I slid a copy of the marriage certificate across the table. Thomas Walsh and Melissa Richardson Walsh, married September 15, 2015. No divorce decree on file in any county in Arizona. David picked up the document with shaking hands. This can't be real. It is. Which means David can walk away from this right now with no legal consequences. No divorce proceedings, no division of assets, no alimony. I looked at Melissa, who was staring at me with undisguised hatred. Of course, bigamy is a felony in most states. You vindictive old witch, she hissed. Maybe. But I'm a vindictive old witch who did her homework. David was still staring at the marriage certificate. How long have you known? Since the night you first came to my house about the bank charges. I hired an investigator the next day. An investigator? Melissa laughed, but there was hysteria in it. You hired someone to spy on us? I hired someone to find out who you really were. And now we all know. I looked at my son, seeing the devastation in his eyes. The question is, what are you going to do about it? David set the paper down carefully like it might explode. When he looked at Melissa, there was nothing left of the love that had blinded him for so long. Pack your things, he said quietly. David, wait. Let me explain. Explain what? That you lied about loving me? That you lied about being pregnant? That you lied about being legally able to marry me in the first place. His voice was getting louder, attracting more attention from the other customers. What explanation could you possibly have that would make any of this okay? Melissa looked around the coffee shop, seeming to notice for the first time that people were staring. Her public persona kicked in automatically, tears welling up in her eyes. Please don't do this here, she whispered. People are watching. Let them watch, David said. Maybe they should see what you really are. But even in his anger, he was still too kind. Too decent. He threw a $20 bill on the table and headed for the door, expecting her to follow. Melissa looked at me one last time. This isn't over. Yes, I said calmly, it is. After they left, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, nursing a cup of tea that had gone cold long ago. The young mother with the toddler finished her meal and left. The elderly man folded his newspaper and shuffled out into the night. The college students packed up their laptops and headed back to their dorms. Normal people finishing normal evenings, unaware that they'd just witnessed a predator's downfall. My phone buzzed with a text from David. Can I come over tomorrow? We need to talk. I typed back. Of course. I love you. It would take time to rebuild what Melissa had broken between us. David would need to live with the guilt of what he'd done, and I would need to find a way to forgive him for choosing her over me, even temporarily. But we would rebuild. Because despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal and the theft, we were still family. And Melissa Richardson Walsh, whatever her real name was, would have to find her next victim somewhere else. I finished my cold tea, left a tip for the server who'd politely ignored the drama at table 12, and drove home through the quiet streets of my neighborhood. Tomorrow, David would come to me broken and ashamed, looking for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. I was ready to give it to him, but first I had one more call to make. David came to my house the next morning carrying a single suitcase and wearing yesterday's clothes. His key still worked, but this time he knocked first. When I opened the door, he looked like the lost little boy he'd once been. The one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. She's gone, he said simply. I stepped aside to let him in. Where did she go? I don't know. When I got home last night, she'd taken whatever she could carry and left. The BMW is gone too. He set his suitcase down in the front hallway, the same spot where he dropped his school backpack every day for 12 years. She cleaned out our joint checking account before she left. $300. That's all we had left. I let him into the kitchen and put the kettle on. Some conversations required tea. Mom, he said, sitting heavily at the table where I'd fed him breakfast for most of his childhood. I don't know how to apologize for what I did. I don't know how to make this right. You start by telling me the truth. All of it. He nodded, running his hands through his hair. She said you had more money than you needed, that you were hoarding it out of fear that family should share everything. She made it sound like we were helping you by taking some of the burden away. And you believed that? I wanted to believe it. She was so sure, so convincing. And I. He stopped, his voice breaking slightly. I was tired of being the son who never quite measured up. The one who couldn't afford to buy you nice presents at Christmas or take you out to fancy dinners. When she said we could use your money to build something better, to become the kind of family you deserved, it felt like a way to finally be enough. The kettle whistled, giving me a moment to process his words. Even in his confession, he was trying to make this about his own insecurities rather than his choices. David, I said, pouring hot water over tea bags, I never needed you to be anything other than my son. I never needed expensive gifts or fancy dinners. I know that now. But at the time, he shrugged helplessly. She was very good at making me see things her way. I brought 2 cups to the table and sat across from him. When did you start to suspect she was lying? Honestly, part of me always knew something was off. The stories about her past never quite added up. She'd tell me about her childhood, but the details would change. Different schools, different friends, different versions of the same events. He wrapped his hands around his mug like he was trying to warm something that had gone cold deep inside. But whenever I questioned her, she'd get upset. She'd say I didn't trust her. That I was just like her ex-husband who never believed anything she said. Thomas Walsh. Right. She painted him as this paranoid, controlling man who drove her away with his constant suspicion. Made me feel guilty for having doubts. He took a sip of tea, grimacing slightly. God, I was such an idiot. You were manipulated by a professional. That doesn't excuse what I did to you. He was right about that. Good intentions and manipulation didn't erase the fact that he'd watched me enter my PIN, memorized it, and used it to steal from me. They didn't erase the fact that he'd chosen her word over mine when I tried to warn him. But they were a starting point. Where will you go? I asked. I don't know. I can't afford the house payments without her income, fake as it was. I'll probably have to declare bankruptcy. Let them repossess everything. He laughed bitterly. Funny thing is, I don't even care. It was all bought with stolen money anyway. I just want it gone. And then what? I was hoping. He looked at me with such desperate hope that my heart ached. I was hoping maybe I could stay here for a while, just until I get back on my feet. I'll get a real job, a full-time job. I'll pay rent. I'll pay back every penny I stole from you, even if it takes the rest of my life. I studied my son's face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize in Melissa. But all I saw was genuine remorse and a desperate desire to make amends. The guest room is available, I said quietly. The relief that washed over his features was so profound I thought he might cry. But, I continued, there are conditions. He nodded eagerly. Anything. First, you get counseling. Real therapy with a licensed professional who specializes in manipulation and abuse. Because David, what happened to you was abuse, even if you were complicit in some of it. Okay. Second, you get a job within 2 weeks. I don't care what it is or how much it pays, but you work. Full-time, legitimate employment with taxes and benefits. Done. Third, you pay me back. Not the full amount. I'm writing off most of it as an expensive lesson. But you pay me back something every month, even if it's only $50. Because you need to understand that actions have consequences. And I need to know that you understand the value of what you took. How much do you want me to pay back? I've been thinking about this since yesterday. The controlled account had held $400,000. But they'd only been able to spend $312,000 before the limits kicked in. The house and car would likely be repossessed, leaving them with nothing to show for their theft. $20,000, I said. At whatever rate you can afford with no interest and no deadline. But it gets paid. That's more than fair. That's incredibly generous. No, it's practical. It's an amount that will remind you every month of what you did without crushing you financially for the rest of your life. He reached across the table and took my hands. Mom, I swear to you, I will never let anyone come between us again. I will never betray your trust again. I hope not. But David, if you do, if you ever steal from me again, if you ever choose someone else's word over mine when they're clearly lying, you're done. I will not give you another chance after this one. Understood. We sat in silence for a while, drinking our tea and listening to the grandfather clock tick in the hallway. Finally David spoke. What happened to the money? The money we took. I almost smiled. It's still in the account they took it from. The controlled account I set up specifically to catch whoever was stealing from me. His eyes widened. You mean? I mean I've had it back all along. The house they bought, the car. It's all going to be repossessed because they can't make the payments. But my money was never actually gone. But the bank statements showed exactly what I wanted them to show. David, I've been planning for something like this since the first time Melissa asked about my finances. He stared at me in amazement. How did you know? Because I've been around long enough to recognize predators. And because she wasn't as clever as she thought she was. My phone rang, interrupting our conversation. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, I heard a familiar voice. Mrs. Peterson? This is Detective Rodriguez with the Fraud Division. We have someone here who'd like to speak with you about your daughter-in-law. I looked at David, who was watching me with curiosity. What about her? She's been arrested for credit card fraud in Phoenix. Apparently, she tried to use fake identification to open several new accounts, and when they ran her fingerprints, she came back as a person of interest in multiple fraud cases across 3 states. I felt a deep sense of satisfaction settle in my chest. I see. She's claiming that you have evidence that could help her case. Something about a misunderstanding with family money. Detective Rodriguez, I said calmly. I'd be happy to provide you with all the evidence I have about Melissa Richardson. When would be convenient? After I hung up, David was staring at me with something approaching awe. You called the police? I called several police departments. Phoenix, Portland, Denver. Anywhere I could find victims of her previous scams. I finished my tea and set the cup down with a satisfied click. I may be a vindictive old witch, but I'm a thorough vindictive old witch. David laughed for the first time since this whole mess began. It was a rusty sound but genuine. What happens now? He asked. Now you move into the guest room. You find a job. You go to therapy. You pay me back $20 at a time if that's all you can afford. I stood up and put our cups in the dishwasher. And I go back to my garden. The roses need pruning before winter. And Melissa? Melissa is no longer our problem. That evening, I sat in Harold's chair with a glass of wine and the newspaper, feeling more at peace than I had in months. The house was quiet except for the sound of David moving around upstairs, unpacking his single suitcase into the room that had been his before he left for college. It would take time to trust him completely again. Time to rebuild what Melissa had broken between us. But we had time. We had the rest of our lives to figure out how to be a family again. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. This is all your fault. You destroyed my marriage. I looked at the message for a long moment, then deleted it and blocked the number. Some people never learned. But I'd learned something too. I'd learned that being alone wasn't the same as being lonely. And that sometimes the best way to protect yourself from predators was to become one yourself. Outside, the autumn wind was rattling the windows again. But inside my house, my sanctuary, my refuge, the place I'd shared with Harold and raised our son, everything was finally blessedly quiet. I raised my wine glass in a silent toast to Harold, wherever he was, and to the future I was going to build without anyone else's permission or approval. The money in my accounts was mine. The house was mine. My life was mine. And that was exactly how I intended to keep it.